So I'm here today to talk about the open standards and Marathi software, which we're building as a framework and toolkit for real-world adaptive management of conservation projects and programs. I wear a couple hats. One hat I wear is for Foundations of Success. We are a not-for-profit organization. We've been around about a dozen years, and our mission is to improve how conservation gets done. But we don't actually implement conservation projects ourselves. We try to make other people's projects and programs better. So we work with folks of all shapes and sizes to design, manage, monitor, and learn from what they do. I'm also part of something much bigger called the Conservation Measures Partnership, or CMP. And this is not a legal entity, but it's a community of practice. It started off when representatives of a bunch of the NGOs you see here got together for an afternoon to talk about performance measures and learning. And we found we had so much to talk about, we turned it into a regular thing where we ended up adding other NGOs around the world. Increasingly, we've been bringing in the private foundations who have become members of CMP who are interested in these issues. And in the last couple of years, we've been adding various government agencies here, both in the US and around the world, who are part of this conversation. Part of my stealth agenda for being here today is we could maybe talk about adding another logo to this illustrious list of folks that we see here. I'm also finally wearing a hat of Marathi and Marathi Share, which are software programs that help people implement some of this adaptive management work that I'll talk about in a bit. And I shouldn't have said finally, because the other reason I'm here is I'm also a local stakeholder. I live on the banks of the Potomac Gorge, right about there. This is my neighborhood having a party in the middle of the Potomac River, so we actually live in the watershed, literally. And here's my daughters, kind of in the water, both in summer and in winter as well. So I'm a stakeholder, and I care about the Potomac Gorge, and I care about the Chesapeake. So we're interested in managing conservation and natural resource projects. And for us, when I use that word project, I mean something that comes in all shapes and sizes. It could be my neighbors going out and knocking off invasive weeds from the banks of the Potomac Gorge without any kind of outside intervention, whatever it might be. But it could be a state or national park. It could be a range-wide plan for an endangered species. It could be standard performance measures for funding programs. Maybe a state wildlife action plan for all of California or Idaho. Or cross-agency work on Lake Ontario or Puget Sound. So these are all examples of projects where we've applied these open standards that I'll be talking about at different scales. And as you probably know, hearing just from the number of organizations and agencies involved in this particular program, conservation projects have a number of unique or challenging things they face. One is that they take place in very complex and dynamic systems. They need to deal with ongoing unpredictable change, and they're dealing with competitors that are changing quickly. They also lack complete information, must take immediate action in the face of uncertainty, and they can improve and learn. And so all of these are conditions that were identified a while back to lead to something called adaptive management, which is a term I know you guys throw around and a lot of people throw around. So what is adaptive management? Well, often you hear people say, well, I'm going to do whatever I want, and I'll tell my bosses or my funders I'm managing adaptively. So I can just go out and try something, and if it don't work, that's adaptive management. Well, we'd like to sort of maybe not have that be one of the definitions. But a few years back in the 70s and 80s, Buzz Holly and a bunch of folks, a bunch of ecologists, came up with a much more formal concept of adaptive management to meet some of those conditions that we talked about. And they talked about managing for ecological resilience, to treat your policies as experiments, that you had to develop models to understand the system and the experiment, and they even talked a lot about passive versus active experimentation, different ways of getting knowledge about the system. So it was really cool stuff. It was really inspirational. But we found a bit of a challenge with it. So this is from a book where they were talking about lessons for ecological policy design. And they said compressions and simplifications are essential to encapsulate understanding and help intuition play a central role in the analysis and to facilitate communication in the transfer process to policymakers. So they got that part, right? But in that same chapter, they then have a bunch of equations that look like this. I love this. The interpretation of equation 9 is both simple and important. Keep that in mind. And then they put out diagrams like that, and that's a diagram as used in policy analysis. Would you want to hand that to one of your policymakers? I don't know what to make of that. So it was very mathematical, it was very ecological, and a bit academic. And so taking the inspiration of what Buzz and all those folks came up with, what we set out to really do was see if could we take this idea of adaptive management and turn it into something a little bit more operational, realizable for real-world conservation. So a few years back, the members of the CMP, we said, well, we're not the first field to think about this problem. Let's look at what business or education or public health has done in this area. And each of those numbers represents a different kind of system for doing performance measures that we looked at in each of these different fields. This next slide is a little scary. Are you ready? It's the history of performance measures in the business world over the last 500 years. It goes back to the invention of double-entry bookkeeping in Italy in the 1500s. And each of these blue boxes, you may have heard of Six Sigma or balanced scorecards or performance benchmarking. It's a different system that that business community has come up with to deal with some of these questions and to deal with some of the conditions we were talking about. I'll spare you all the gory details. I can show you a similar chart for each of those other fields that we looked at. Here's what we found at the bottom line. One is that people went from doing big formal evaluations at the end of a project or program to more ongoing evaluations, to then putting that information in the context of project cycle-based work. In every one of those fields, people went to doing that kind of approach. Another thing is that there were different systems needed for different kinds of information needs. So a status question that says, how are salmon doing, or how is that salmon habitat doing, is a very different question than the question of, if we're dumping a bunch of woody debris in a stream because we think it's going to lead to better salmon habitat, is that a good thing to be doing? And the dirty secret of the conservation world is we do a lot of things like this, but we have no idea whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, a waste of money, it's killing the patient. We do a lot of stuff that we don't know whether it's really going to work. And we need to figure out how those things work. The last part of the puzzle was that we all found we were confusing the heck out of each other with words. So how many of you have ever been in a debate? What's bigger, a goal or an objective? And how does that relate to an outcome? And how does that relate to a, on and on and on, right? And so when we looked at the systems our different organizations were using, we're talking about the same things, but we're all using words in different ways. So all that led us to create what we call the open standards for the practice of conservation. The word open comes from the idea of open source. Nobody owns them. Anyone can take them and adapt them. They are managed, though, through a change process. We're up to version 3. And these are a set of best practices, we think, for designing, managing, monitoring, and learning from conservation work. These are the open standards. Every time I put up the cycle, I want to make it really clear to folks, at the highest level, there's nothing in here that Deming didn't invent 50 years ago with Plan, Check, Do, Act. In fact, there's nothing here that Greeks didn't invent 2,000 years ago with the invention of the scientific method. So this is not a brand new cycle. But as I hope can convince you, what we've been able to do is figure out ways to help people implement these basic concepts in a more practical way, fitting conservation needs. So at the highest level, what these standards involve is defining your problem. What is it you care about? In this case, maybe we're out in the Pacific, we're helping a community manage their marine resources. Who's on the project team? So who's having the conversation? Just judging from the number of people around this table in organizations, this is a really important point. Who's involved in that conversation? Who's starting it? Who carries it forward? And then we ask people, remember how Holly had this idea of you have to have models of the system? We want to help people develop a mental model of what's going on in their system. So we ask people to identify what are the conservation targets, and also what are some of the barriers or direct threats that they're facing. So maybe that turtle is becoming someone's dinner, maybe we care about fish stocks, and those fish are being commercially harvested, and they're also really important to that community as a protein source. So we're going to model, as a group, what do we think is going on in this particular system? And then we're going to plan what we're going to do. My old boss at MacArthur Foundation used to talk about what makes a plan strategic. It's not what you can just tell me what you are going to do. It's what you can tell me what you're not going to do and why. It's about making systematic choices. And so these open standards help people say, well, which targets require attention? Which threats are most critical? How do we best spend our limited time and treasure to change that situation? And so we'll help people think about all the things they could do to change that situation. And then going back to Holly again, we want to take those ideas, in this case, maybe setting up a locally managed marine reserve with the idea that that will lead to more resources for the community and for conservation. We're going to articulate our actions as a hypothesis that we can then test to see whether it works or whether it doesn't. So that's the essence of brainstorming about what we're going to do and then treating it as a hypothesis. Based on that, we then have to collect information. So in this case, this community is counting the numbers of clams before and after they set up that no-take reserve. You have to actually analyze, use, and adapt the data. This is always a challenge. But in this case, you can see that the blue boxes were the numbers of clams they had before they set up the intervention. The orange was after. So in this case, the intervention seemed to work pretty well. In many cases, the intervention doesn't work. Okay, well, what are you going to learn from that? How are you going to take that information, share it, most importantly, with your project team, but also with the rest of the world so we can learn to get better? And so when I'm talking about open adaptive management, what I would like to say is the definition of adaptive management is really that, in an iterative fashion. Or if you guys prefer, we could do that. So, I mean, this is not very different what you guys have as your stated policy of how you're approaching it. In fact, we could do at some point a lineup of these different boxes, and it's a very, very close correlation. But what I mean by adaptive management is doing that in a systematic and dedicated way. Okay, we good? All right. So what we also have then is a bunch of tools to support those open standards. So these are the open standards. We can give you guidance and threat ratings and ways of doing sticky tarps and analyses. There are tools like situation analyses. So this is a slightly more complex example of a water, looking at water resources in a watershed. What are your targets? What do you care about? What are those pressures that are facing those particular targets? And then as a team, you might say, well, what are the drivers of those pressures? So we care about the quantity of water, and so water withdrawals, what are the different sources of that? We care about also the quality of the water, and so what are the different sources of pollution? But it's a way to lay out in visual form that hopefully policymakers can get their head around what's going on in that world. Once you pick that, you can figure out when to intervene. Another key tool are these results chains, which show the theory of change or the hypothesis behind your action. So in this case, they're looking at waterway buffers. Those are the direct threats that we want to overcome. So we might have an intervention of finding which watersheds to work on. We then implement the practices, get agreement to implement the practice at each site, get the buffers completed, and then get the outcomes at each site. You can see a lot more detail. On those details, I know you can't read all this, but you can also hang the time series that you're expecting to see change. You can hang the activities that people need to do, and you can hang the indicators that you're going to track to look at performance. So it's a way of, again, laying out very clearly for everybody involved what's that theory of change or that hypothesis. The other thing that we do is we provide lots of training. You can now take a course in open standards at about 20 different universities around the world. There's a coaches network of people around the world who are trained in using this methodology. And we offer courses at places like NCTC and many other places to help people go through this work. We've created a set of standard terms to describe conservation work, so that if that's what you're facing, and one group talks about cows, the next cattle, the next livestock, the next grazing, the next ranching, you put that in a database, you'll never be able to roll up that you're all dealing with the same threat, right? So we worked with, especially for threats and actions, we worked with IUCN, and we created a taxonomy of actions and a standard taxonomy of threats as a way of describing what's going on in the world that people can use in a common way. But we also have now developed Marathi. Marathi is the Swahili word for project or goal. If any of you are familiar with TurboTax, TurboTax walks you step by step through the processes of doing your taxes, and it gives you the forms to fill out. Marathi is a desktop software tool that does much the same. So this is walking you step by step through doing a threat ranking. This gives you the tools to do the threat ranking down here. It also lets you do all those diagrams and things that I showed you and created there. So it's a software tool to allow you to do that in a desktop environment. More importantly, and I also put this for Bill, I still would like to add your conceptual diagrams into Marathi one of these days. So it's a way of aggregating different ways about thinking about a problem. What we also now are starting to do, though, is go from beyond projects. So if I think about one project, which as you know now is a group of people using some strategies to change the world, I also want to introduce the idea of program. And a program is both a project in its own right, but it's also a series of repeated projects that add up to a whole. And so what we're starting to do now is think about how do we develop the tools to allow people to go from project management to program management. And so we have now a new system called Marathi Share. It's an online cloud-based system in which you develop your program framework with standard terms and all those standard taxonomies. You use that to create individual projects that you're going to focus on, but now all that project data sits in the cloud in a SQL-compatible database. And once that information is in the cloud, you can both query it and you can analyze it and start to make sense and think about the reports needed to do it. So it's a system to really enable this kind of thinking. The whole point of this is if we create a culture of data sharing within a project team, across people in a program, or across multiple programs, we can start to then think about these questions of, are we dumping wooded debris in a stream? Is that a good thing to do? People like Andrew Pullen at the Center for Evidence-Based Conservation, they can now start to do meta-analysis on all those different experiences, and we can actually learn where these things work and where they don't, and grow and improve what we're doing over time. So, in conclusion, I've been looking a bunch at the website and the stuff you guys developed. You guys are really far along this stuff. You have some of the coolest tools I know out there to do this kind of thing. You have all these different stakeholders who are out there. I point to everybody as Chesapeake Stat if people want a good example of how to sort of display and show information across a large scale. I think this is one of the best examples that I've seen. And you have obviously have the fiscal resources to do a lot of stuff. But I think there's an interesting challenge here of how do you build on these tools how do you take these concepts of adaptive management and how do you really kind of take it to the next level? And I think that if you're interested, I think the open standards could be an interesting part of that conversation. So I'll pause there, I'll stop there, and see if there's any questions.
Thanks.